All right, we're going to go ahead and get this going here in a second. I'm on. We're going to call this meeting to order of the House Energy, Utilities, and Telecommunications Committee. And today we're having a hearing. We're going to hear from Georgia Power, Jeff Grubb, who is the Director of Resource Policy and Planning with Georgia Power, Greg Ford, who's the President and CEO Georgia System Operations Corporation, and then I think from MEAG, Stephen Jackson, Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of MEAG Power. I think he may be on Zoom, but wanted to have this hearing today to kind of get an update on preparedness and what these different providers do. I think especially regarding the grid. Just have some. I think a lot of people probably have questions about that, especially after the extremely bad weather that's hit parts of the country and seemed to have done, from what I've read anyway, more damage down in Texas than any place else. And it's we have a different situation here in Georgia. So, but I think it's a good idea to hear from these people. These are the experts, and let them tell us about what they do, how the grid. Interoperability is different here in Georgia and the Southeast than it is in Texas, and but they know what they're going to tell us. So I'm going to, with that, I'm going to introduce or recognize. I think we have first Jeff Grubb, Director, Resource Policy and Planning with Georgia Power.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hopefully this, I can hear that it works. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for having us here. My name is Jeff Grubb. I'm the Director of Resource Policy and Planning at Georgia Power Company. I'm on the team that's responsible for long-term generation planning, which is looking out into the future, figuring out what generation resources we need to meet future customer needs. Texas has put a shining light on this part of our business, but it's one we've been doing for a long time. We've got a lot of success here in the state. With the House bill that was set up in the early 90s that allows Georgia Power to go through our IRP process. The other entities in the state have processes that have led to a lot of success in Georgia. We've had challenges, we'll have challenges, but looking forward to talking about that more today.
So, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. We certainly want to thank you for the invitation for all of us to be here and be able to speak to you today. My name is Greg Ford. I'm President and CEO of Georgia System Operations Corporation, or you may see the acronym GSOC as we go through this. GSOC is one of the family of companies that works to serve the electric needs of the 38 EMCs of Georgia. GSOC controls, monitors, electric generation, transmission, and distribution assets for the EMCs, and we balance the demand and supply of energy that flows to the EMCs on a real-time basis. I also would like to point out, while not here with us today, but on Zoom, is Steve Jackson, as was mentioned, from MEAG. He is also available for questions or comments as we go through the presentation. I look forward to discussing operations with you and responding to your questions today. But I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff and allow him to walk through the first stages.
Thank you, Greg. So what we wanted to do today was we'll talk some about ERCOT. We aren't ERCOT experts. There's still a lot of information coming out of what happened at ERCOT, but we'll talk about some of the things we have learned and seen from that. and then I'll go through long-term planning and how we look at generation planning in the state, specifically the reliability aspects of that. And then I'll turn it over to Greg to talk about the day-to-day operations and how we do that in the state. Then I'll come back and talk some about the investment we've put in the actual wires and grid in the state, and then we'll let Mr. Jackson add any comments there. So if the slide presentation, I don't know how we're working that, but once it's up, okay, great. So the next slide on ERCOT. So I think the main thing on ERCOT that we can take away is that what happened in Texas was very tragic. It was highly impactful. It's obvious that it was a once-in-a-century type of event that overwhelmed the grid there in Texas. And so there's going to be a lot of studies, a lot of learnings coming out of that for the whole industry, for the whole nation, over several months and probably years. It's a very complicated issue, a lot of moving pieces, but we do know a few things that we can take away from that and then talk about how we are different here in Georgia. One is the market structure in Texas. And so what the slide is showing is there are 3 grids in North America. There's the Western Interconnection, which is really the southwest of the Rockies, all physically interconnected out there with each other. The Eastern Interconnection, which we are part of, that's the world's largest machine. That entire interconnection is physically connected between all the entities and utilities on that side of the country. And then you have the Texas Interconnection, which is run by the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT. So what that lends itself to is when Texas has events like they had last week, they have a much less, they are much more constrained from being able to lean on some of their neighboring utilities. I think Greg will speak to that a little bit more later, but they're limited in what they can do by getting help from their neighbors. In the Eastern Interconnection, we're all very coordinated within the state, within the southeast, and on up. And so you're able to balance across a larger area. Texas was not able to do that. The other aspect of their market is that it is a deregulated, energy-only market, meaning the generation plants are owned by certain entities, the transmission wires are owned by certain entities, the operations are governed by a different entity, and the way you make money as a generator in Texas is to generate power. You have to sell power and get people to pay for it. That's the only way you really get paid. So that market structure doesn't really incent reliability investment like our structure here in the Southeast does. And we'll talk about that more when we go through our parts. But those were big drivers on what happened in ERCOT. When you look at what happened last week in February, there were 2 major drivers that we know that happened. Loads far exceeded the forecast that they had. And it wasn't just a little bit above, it was drastically higher from what I've seen. And then they had a lot of issues with their generation performance. They had generating units tripping offline from frozen instrumentation, pipeline issues, some coal pile issues. So when you think about what we do when we plan for the system, when you have a whole lot more demand than you ever expected and you have a whole lot less supply to meet it, then you run into an issue of having to shed load. And that's what happened there. Now, to be clear, that was a very, very highly impactful event. It was single-digit temperatures. Texas has never seen it for several days. And so it wasn't something you typically plan to, but we feel like our structure in the Southeast would allow us to be better able to handle that type of information. So if we go to the next slide, please. So from a generation reliability planning standpoint in Georgia, we look at resource adequacy, which is a key part of that, especially for vertically integrated utilities like we have here in our state that have an obligation to serve. So we are held accountable for the reliability of service. And we're vertically integrated, meaning we are responsible for the generating units, we're responsible for the transmission lines, we're responsible for the distribution lines. So we are held responsible, Georgia Power from the Public Service Commission, Oglethorpe and MAG from its members, and all of us to the state. So we know that we can look at the entirety of the supply chain in the state, and we've got the responsibility for making that reliable. Resource adequacy, simply put, is do we have enough generating units or supply side resources and demand side resources like an interruptible load program to meet the demand that our customers have across several different situations. Not all, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, But when you look out and think of how can I serve them, do I have enough resources and generation to do that? Our utilities in the state determine that with what we call a reserve margin study that I'll speak to on the next slide. That's really looking at how much more generation do I need above normally expected to serve our customers. Our reserve margin at Georgia Power is filed every 3 years as part of our IRP process, or our integrated planning process with the Public Service Commission. Oglethorpe, MEAG, others do the same types of studies and get approval from their governance bodies as well. So the first part of planning is, do I have enough resources to meet what my customer needs? Next slide, please. So we do that through what we call a reserve margin. And a reserve margin is how we handle that issue. So we plan for kind of expected load, expected situations. We don't know exactly what kind of crazy weather event or some extreme weather event or some impact on our units are going to be. So we plan for expected cases, and that's represented kind of by those dark gray bars that are the kind of our normal demands of our customers. But we know that there's uncertainty around weather. We know there's uncertainty around what we're forecasting 10 to 20 years out. We understand that there's uncertainty around how your generating units can perform, and we also understand there's uncertainty around how much you might be able to get from your neighbors. So our reserve margin study looks at how much more generation do I need above expected or kind of average to handle all that uncertainty. It's very complicated, a lot of drivers, but at the end of the day, that's what we're looking at. And looking at Texas, they had an event that they were not prepared for, once in a century type thing. We had the last several years ago, we had the Polar Vortex that taught us a lot about that as well. It was a very impactful situation in the Southeast. We had a lot of challenges in the Southeast. Out of that, we learned there was a lot more winter load out there than we knew. We had 10 years of very mild winters. We figured there was a lot more winter load out there on the electric side. We also found some issues or weaknesses in some of our generating units that had never gone through cold winters. Same thing Texas has. Theirs was just a lot colder and longer. But out of that, we came into our last IRP. I believe the other members do this, the other entities do this too. We look at winter and summer now. We used to be able to just look at summer, plan for summer, and winter was fine. There's several drivers of that. Winter loads have grown more from the electrical side over the last several years than summer loads have. Everybody's got an air conditioner, but they're getting more efficient, but not everybody has electric heat. As that grows, that narrows. We've added a lot of renewables, mainly solar in Georgia, that help on the summer peak, that hot afternoon in the summer, don't help at 5, 6 a.m. in the winter. Had to start looking at it differently. And then we added more gas units. Gas units have more impact from weather in winter than they do in the summer. So we realized and started planning, got approval from the commission to start looking at both. And what the reserve margin says is how much do I need on the ground to serve customers? Next slide, please. So the next slide is how do you do that? So now we've figured out we need to have, for lack of a better term, kind of a safety margin above what we expect on a normal situation. This study provides a range of margins and looks at the cost and the reliability performance. So do you need 10% more than your kind of normal situation, 20, 30? What do you need? So we study that. But obviously the more generation you add, the more cost you have. But at the same time, you have a more reliable system from a generation standpoint, and that's what we're talking about here is generation to serve load. The final result is a balance of both of those. You don't want to go as cheap as you can because now you have a lot of reliability issues. If you try to handle every reliability issue, it's going to cost you too much. So where do you find that optimum level? And once you have that, then that guides your actions. So on the circles, what we're showing here is it's a very robust study. It takes months to do. We look at all of the historical weather that we've had in Georgia from 50 plus years. We do have some extreme weather events in the last 50 years in Georgia. Nothing as long and as cold as Texas had, but we had some. We look at what does that do to the system we have today. And we look at 50 plus years. We also look at does that peak happen on a Saturday or does that happen on a Wednesday? Completely different. Weekends, a lot less industrial load, not as big of an event. Middle of the week, much bigger event. We study all of those cases. And then we look at, all right, how much may we miss the forecast by? We're thinking 10 years down the road, next year, what are we serving there's error in that. So what happens if your loads grow a lot higher, just like Texas saw? And then what happens with your generation outage? We do all of those studies, thousands and thousands of simulations across a range of resources. So we end up running 700 or something thousand cases and looking at what the system looks like. That doesn't mean we plan to handle all of them, but we do study them and plan for them. So if something occurs, even if we're not totally able to meet that need, we've got a lot better understanding of it. At a minimum, we make sure that we have a projected once in 10 years at worst reliability. So we want to make sure that in those hundreds of thousands of situations on the reserve margin or the amount that we pick, you don't have an outage more than once every 10 years. We usually perform better than that, but that's a minimum. So we could spend hours and days on just that study itself, but what we're looking at is all those different factors and where do we want that number to be. Next slide, please. So once you've figured out my reserve margin needs to be this many more megawatts above my expected load, you've got to be able to have resources to meet that amount. So when we look as in the state that we need X amount of megawatts, you've got to make sure that you can count on them. And so there's other components of a reliable system. And this gets to where we're different than Texas as well. So we maintain a very diverse generation resource mix in the state from a technology standpoint, and you can see that on the right. That's Georgia Power's, but the state is similar. They're very diversified too amongst MEAG and OPC. We also, not only from a technology standpoint, but we also diversify our fuel supply basins. So for a gas unit or a coal unit, we get those from different suppliers. Transportation on fuel, whether it's bringing in rail cars of coal or pipelines from gas, we diversify it. So it's somewhat like a stock portfolio. The more you diversify, the more you reduce your risk. But we make sure that we've got those resources that help us meet that need. The other big part that we're able to do in this state that I think we'll see is some of the issue in Texas is investing in those resources to make sure they're available. They're not always available, but you've got to do everything you can do. A big part of that is firm fuel supply. So we get firm transportation for any gas units. What that means is when we contract with a pipeline to bring gas, we pay for and reserve our part of that pipeline that we always have access to. So when you see things like winter demand drives up pipelines, we have our reserve spot. It's very important that we have that. We do not plan on a gas unit that does not have that. We also have oil backup. That's come in handy. You don't need it very often, but when you need it, it's very helpful. And we also have gas storage that's in the southeast for us to take advantage of. So if there's an issue with some supply getting into the pipes, we actually have storage that we can put into the pipes and get to our plants. So we make sure that we've got a very firm fuel supply to those units. Coal and nuclear have it on site, whether it be a coal pile or nuclear, only has to be refueled every year and a half or so. So they're firm. The other big piece is an operation and maintenance spending. So we, in the state of Georgia, are able to invest in those units to make sure they're available from a reliability standpoint, whether they run or not. So the graphs on the right show energy mix, which is just how much they actually run and put kilowatt hours on the grid, versus capacity, which is the ability to do that. So if you look at like a nuclear part of that, nuclear is not a huge part of our capacity, but it runs all the time because it should. That's what it's built for. So it's a lot bigger part of energy. You've got units like a oil-fired CT, which is a combustion turbine or basically a jet engine. You don't run it very often at all, but when you need it, when it's really cold, and it might only be every few years, you need that unit. We're able to invest in that unit whether it runs or not. In Texas, that unit wouldn't make any money because it doesn't dispatch and run and make money in the system. So we are able to invest in our resources to help us meet that reserve margin so we can count on them. And then we also have an integrated transmission and generation planning. Generation doesn't do you any good if you can't get it to where it needs to go with the wires. So we are all in the state invested in and responsible for both of those. So we're able to make sure that the transmission system is invested in, removes congestion so that these generation resources can actually run and supply customers like they need to, and vice versa. Generation helps transmission as well. So it's integrated. Again, the point here is you've got to figure out how much you need, and you've got to have resources that are able to serve that need. And so that in the state of Georgia, we are able to invest in the resources we need to make them available. Again, we do not plan for perfect reliability. There are events that if we could have a difficulty of having enough generation to serve load. If we had single digits for several weeks like several days like Texas, we would struggle. However, by how we go through our planning, we would be a lot better able to accommodate that than some other areas do, and we would be able to move forward with that. So that's the planning side of the house. What I've always said we do on the generation planning side of the house is we're forecasting and building the fleet of the future that operations are going to run one day, and that's what Greg does. So I'll let Mr. Ford speak through operations.
Thank you, Jeff. So as Jeff has talked about planning, which both MEAG and the EMCs as well, we all do, and appropriately. The resource is there, it's planned, and operations then is simply there to put all of that planning in action. And that's really what we do as we go forward. We're looking at the week ahead, day ahead, month ahead, and we're putting the plans and the resources that we have that are available. And I say available because we have to do maintenance on our units and things like that. So as we get closer to that real-time time frame, we're coordinating all of that activity as we go forward. As you look at that next slide, I'm sorry. As you look at this slide, I do want to point out the number one word on that slide is coordinated. MEAG, GSOC, Georgia Power, we have an operations environment where everything is coordinated and we work together. Not only do we have long-term strategic agreements for operations with each other, but we also have them with our neighboring utilities that support us when the grid gets stressed, as you heard from Jeff. So this means if a generator fails, we have the combined capability of all of our resources to help mitigate the impact of that system or that generator, which improves our resiliency across the state. The reliability of the transmission system is equally critical. In Georgia, we use this integrated transmission system that provides strong interconnections throughout the state, throughout the Southern Company balancing area, and then throughout the neighboring utilities. So we can't stress that enough about the interconnections and the strength of the transmission system that we have, especially as it branches out past the borders of Georgia. So I'm going to, as I step through these bullets on the short-term operating plan, the planning horizon talks about talks to the shortness, and we get to that time frame. As we get closer, we begin talking about the operating horizon. We are communicating on a daily basis about plant and fuel availability. You heard a little bit about that. Any operating constraints that exist. Our daily plan to serve our customers and energy needs. So this happens weekly, monthly, daily, hourly as we go through. Transmission outages plans are confirmed in advance. Work together again with all three companies. Near-term generation maintenance and constraints are coordinated. In real time, our utilities operate and maintain a robust system that's capable of alerting operators to alarm limits, events so that actions can be taken to preserve power supply and transmit it safely and continuously across our system. Georgia Power actually performs multiple contingency analysis during the day and communicates any redispatch or issues directly to each of us, and we follow that direction. So what happens when the weather event that becomes a risk to the system? Well, we operate with an increased situational awareness and assume an even more conservative approach to how we operate the system. Our operating plans also include how we respond to failures on the system. We know failures occur. We want to be able to react to them and bring the system back to a stable state as soon as possible. Jeff spoke to you about planning reserves, which set the stage for reliable real-time operations. From all of that firm capacity that Jeff mentioned, that capacity is made available to serve system peak needs. Plans are put together to serve each day's unique energy and demands as we go through the seasons. Part of this is carrying what's called operating reserves. We use those operating reserves to respond to contingencies such as a load forecast error or an unforeseen generator tripping offline for whatever reason. And I do point out generators trip. It doesn't have to be cold weather or anything like that. So we have these additional operating reserves. We work together and we respond to those events. Again, for extreme weather, operationally, we increase that conservative stance to better handle whatever the winter weather may throw at us. You see the NERC reliability standards bullet there. So in addition to everything that we do to being safe and reliable, I should say it goes without saying that all of us follow strict compliance standards on the reliability and the requirements set by NERC, which is the Electric Reliability Organization of North America. So we work together with them to ensure that we are following those reliability standards, which we believe help to provide that sense of resiliency that we have. So a lot has been reported on the state of Texas, certainly operating as an energy island. So I'd like to take just a minute to talk about the coordination that we have with the other utilities. I mentioned the strength of our transmission interconnections with them. But all of us here in Georgia, the EMCs, Georgia Power, and MEAG, are communicating on a daily basis to support each other. If you'll refer back to that very first slide where we had the picture of ERCOT and then there was the big blue Eastern interconnection part, we're coordinating with utilities throughout the broader Southern Company balancing area. So not only do we coordinate in Georgia, do we coordinate with Birmingham, which is the Southern Control Area, which includes Mississippi and parts on into Georgia. We are coordinating with them, and then we reach out to our fellow states next to us, the Carolinas, the Floridas, the Georgias. This type of communication brings a very coordinated situational awareness for all of us. So we're not calling on someone and surprising them that we're having an issue. They see it with us as we build up to it, and we see theirs as they build up. So this situational awareness really works to all of our benefit in the Eastern interconnection, and we really take a lot of pride in making sure that works well. Again, Georgia's talking with all of our utilities, and the energy ebbs and flows as we're going, and we're constantly working with each other on that. If you go to the next slide, please. There's certainly been a lot of news coverage of the failures of the generation that went into the facilities in Texas due to the frigid temperatures, frozen instrumentation, frozen coal piles, as well as frozen turbines. Could there maybe be? Is there another one past that one? Nope.
Should be two more
Two more.
slides.
Uh-oh.
If not, we'll speak to them.
Yeah, so I'll just speak to them. So as I said, there a lot of discussion in the news about these frozen instrumentations, coal piles, and turbines. So I'd like to turn to that topic of winterization. You know, in Georgia, our power generation plants are built and designed to operate in extreme winter weather. The 2014 Polar Vortex that Jeff alluded to certainly hit us hard with some extreme cold temperatures and snow, and that effort has paid off. We were able to meet the demands without shedding any load during that time period. But we did see the warning signs during 2014. Oglethorpe Power, Georgia Power, and MEAG saw the need for stronger winterization of their assets. Our utilities use the technical expertise that is there, engineering consultants, as well as NERC guidance, and we implemented design improvements across our fleet of power plants to safeguard against sub-zero temperatures. On this slide, I listed a few examples of winterization, which is there now, thank you. These are projects that we've completed since 2014 across the state, and you can see them there. They've everything from insulation upgrades, heat tracing, heat enclosures, protecting that instrumentation, wind protection. So we work hard to ensure that these generation assets will not only be there when we need them, but will remain there as we go through the cold period. So before I turn it back over to Jeff, I do want to end in a similar realistic word of caution that Jeff put out. Even with the strong interconnectivity that we have with other states and the extensive costly winterization of assets, of extreme events, of our assets, the extreme events can still take place. Mr. Chairman, you asked us to be realistic, not paint an overly rosy picture, and I think we're trying to be very realistic with you. We have a plan for things to happen, and we include significant reserve margins, both the long-term and real-time horizons. And while safety and reliability are always our first concerns, we're not blind to the economic consequences of these priorities. We strongly believe the safeguards and prudent actions we are taking are in the best interest of serving all of our customers reliably and cost effectively. So Jeff, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Greg. Yeah, so one last thing to touch on here on the next slide, please, is grid investment plan. So all of the utilities in Georgia have spent and are going to spend billions of dollars in our wires in the state of Georgia. It's very important to do that. We've talked about the importance of this generation fleet that we have, these operations that Greg talked to. You've got to have the transmission and the lines to facilitate those. So we have all been replacing aging transmission equipment. You know, the state of Georgia Boone, we grew and built a lot of that infrastructure. A lot of it is 40 years old or so. We are proactively going out there and looking at those older pieces of equipment, hundreds of substations, hundreds of miles of transmission lines, and updating them and upgrading them before there's failure to improve the reliability of that transmission grid so we can facilitate all this generation flow within the state and within our neighbors. We're also looking at the reliability of the distribution system. So those feeders that are going down to the customers' facilities. We've looked at a lot of outage history, and we've gone and targeted improvements in the areas that do not have the reliability level that we would like them to have. And so we're working on hundreds of distribution feeders. We've done some self-healing networks, which are mainly networks that when they have an outage, they can they're automated to where they can try to isolate those more in a real-time basis, as opposed to having an event, blocking out an entire circuit, manually having to go out there and look at it. There's some sophisticated controls we have to try to narrow down the scope of those outages. So doing a lot on that because, again, it's important from a reliability standpoint that you've got the generation out there to supply customers and the wires to get it to them. So with that's the end of our slide presentation. Steve Jackson, I think, is on Zoom. So Steve, did you want to add anything, any comments before we move to Q&A?
Thank you. I appreciate a few moments to make a couple of comments. Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to be here with the other utilities in the state, electric utilities, to provide information to the committee and answer any questions you might have on behalf of MEAG Power. I am Steve Jackson, Senior Vice President, Chief Operating Officer for MEAG. For those of you that may be new to the committee, MEAG Power is the wholesale provider for 48 municipalities in one county in Georgia who own their own electric distribution systems, whereby they provide electric power to the residents and businesses in those communities. And they're all across the state, from the smallest communities to some of the larger communities and in urban, suburban, and rural areas of the state. As is with the other utilities in the state, we do own generation, natural gas, combined cycle generation, and co-owners in nuclear and coal with Oglethorpe Power and Georgia Power in the city of Dalton. And we are a partner in the integrated transmission system, owning transmission lines and substations that are part of this jointly planned and operated system. So thanks to Greg and Jeff for presenting on behalf of the electric utilities in the state today. We agree with the points provided by them and would like to just emphasize the benefits that our market structure in Georgia does provide in terms of resiliency and reliability. While no system is fully protected, as was mentioned, in all the scenarios, we believe the system in place in Georgia with the vertically integrated utilities working together to plan and operate the system provides safeguards not enjoyed in some of the regulatory markets. Also, as was mentioned, because the ITS is well connected to other states and regions, that risk of isolation is minimized, as was experienced in Texas. So we've taken the many lessons learned, as was mentioned, from the Polar Vortex to make our assets more resilient, to winterize them, be prepared for these events in the future. And as always, our focus remains on our obligation to serve our Georgia communities and their citizens and ensure we have a reliable system. So once again, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and happy to answer any questions related to MEAG Power that you might have.
Well, thank all of you. Am I on here? Yes. I thought those were excellent presentations. In fact, they were kind of exactly what I was looking for, and hopefully what other members are looking for also. Do we have questions? Would you all mind taking questions if there are any?
I'd be happy to.
If there are any questions from members of the committee, I guess on Zoom, that process where you raise your hand or whatever, you have a question there. But these are some people that can help us with answering these questions. I think they've done a really good job of providing information. But if you have questions, I see one. Representative Thomas.
Can you hear me?
Yes. I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but if you could direct your question, if you can, to a particular presenter, that would be good. And if you can be as specific with your question, that would be great too. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. So, let's see. I guess this would be for Jeff.
Okay, thank you.
Jeff, so we talked a lot about the growing infrastructure, what's going to be required going forward. We talked a lot about weather events today. One of the concerns I have, and as we move into the century with growth and demand on our utility system, is the rise of the electric vehicle and what that means to the death of fossil fuels with regards to gasoline. I try to explain to people that there's this thing called the law of conservation of energy, which means that just because they're plugging their car in and it's advertised as a zero emission vehicle, it's not necessarily zero emission because that power has to be generated somewhere else. I read an article that actually said in 2035, GM is no longer going to produce fossil, gasoline burning vehicles.
Right.
How is Georgia Power and the EMCs working to kind of determine what that additional load is going to be on the Georgia infrastructure moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't deal on our EV aspects every day in terms of what we're doing to promote that. But yeah, we have a load forecasting process that we do every year, and we do have assumptions in there on electrical vehicle growth in the state. We file our IRP every 3 years at the Public Service Commission per the House Bill 280 that was set up by the legislature in the 90s, but we do it every year. We look at it every year. And so we're very involved in that space looking at that. So when we look at what could that EV growth do, it's part of our load forecast that we're planning for. If it were to grow faster, I don't know that it would be so fast that we wouldn't keep up. I mean, obviously it takes a while to deploy some generation resources, but it's part of our forecasting process. I think that it's, generation units are pretty large, and so how much headroom you have to grow into it, but it's part of our load forecasting process. I think there's some benefits that can come from EVs in terms of what it can do for the system. I can't speak to what we're doing infrastructure-wise for charging them, but from a planning standpoint, as that load grows, we'll make sure that we're looking at that forecasted growth and having generation to meet it.
And that was kind of, hit the nail on what I was going with this is, it's not so much how that the power is going to get to the cars, but how you're going to, that resiliency in the system and that additional loads. Because, I mean, it'll eventually eat into your, if we're not moving forward, I mean, it's going to eat into our reserve margins.
That's right.
So, yeah, thank you. I think you answered my question.
So what we do on the reserve margin, and to your point about capacity needs, and I didn't go into that, but it's a great question. We know where we stack up when we look at that 10 to 20 year forecast. So when we see if we're 11 years from now, we're below that reserve margin, when do we need to take action to build that up? And again, we're looking at every year. So if it gets within a certain window, we've got to go add some generation, and we'll do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Good question. Thank you.
Representative Jackson, I think you were next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for Jeff and Greg, and I'm back on your slide for components of reliable.
So my question is for Jeff and Greg. That's the Navy commander coming out too.
That mask was really holding you back. That's great. We hear you great now. We hear you great now.
So my question is around the Georgia Power energy mix and capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And you may not have the answer today, but I'm interested in if you took the same diagram and said, what do we look like in 2030 for Georgia?
Mm-hmm.
2040.
Right.
Right. And now, from a macro perspective, that's one thing, but there's definitely an answer, as the good gentleman asked, when we start looking on load, sharing, and how that energy mix and what that capacity looks like for our renewables, natural gas, etc. Because as more companies obviously are coming to Georgia, right, and they're bringing some highly sophisticated technological capabilities, plants,
Right.
that's going to draw on our grid significantly. And so that's what I would be interested in. If you said 2030, this is what we anticipate our energy mix and our capacity looks like, and that helps us from an economic development standpoint on what that looks like. Because as Georgia continues to grow, I see our population going to continue to grow. I see more homes. Like in my district right now, one neighborhood, 1,300 houses. They're all geothermal. They all have solar, and they're all energy, efficient. This is 1,300 homes.
Right.
Right. And so they're making a significant investment. And I'm just curious. Again, you may not have the answer right now, but I'm curious on what that looks like from a macro perspective.
Right. So a few things there. One, as those types of homes get built, kind of like I mentioned on the EV forecast, we're also trying to forecast what our typical customers use. So as those types of homes become more popular, they're more efficient, so your usage per home is declining. We have an entire team that looks at that from a forecasting perspective. Then what we do in long-term planning, especially when we file it at the commission, and the other companies are doing the same thing, is I now want to look at that 20 to 30 years as I look at that load forecast, different scenarios to figure out what that generation mix may look like. As the price of gas changes, your projections on what your fleet looks like changes. Is it put more pressure on coal, and does the gas look better? As renewables have declined in price, we see more of those. We don't often commit that long-term because we're over every 3 years where we're making those decisions. So we aren't really committing to what exactly 2030 looks like. We do kind of that next step, but we do take that into account in the IRP. We run multiple sensitivities. We look at different gas prices. We look at different carbon regimes. We look at a lot of different sensitivities and say, where do we think the fleet may go? We don't know because many different things can change, but we don't commit to them until we have that need and we go to the commission and commit to them. So there's a lot of moving pieces in that, but as those companies come in that want certain types of resources, we're trying to figure out how we do that because we plan for all customers. But there are a lot of moving pieces. The industry's really facing a lot of change from those standpoints. So we actually have about one of those pop up a day, it seems like, to try to figure out where do we go there. So I think you look forward, I think renewables have to have a role. I think storage is the big next step for us. We're just now getting into that. What does that look like? So from an energy mix standpoint, it's really hard to know right now. We don't have to commit to what exactly 2030 looks like yet, but we will project it so it helps us plan us to get there. I hope I answered some of your question. Greg can speak operationally, I believe.
I won't go too much operationally, but I would like to add a little bit on it from at least from our EMC perspective. Good question, by the way. You know, we're really proud of where we are with the mix and where we're headed with the mix, and as is all of Georgia is, I'm sure. You know, 30% of the EMC's energy requirements right now are supplied by emissions-free generation, and quite honestly, when Vogtle 3 and 4 comes into the picture, that's going to increase up to about 40%. Of course, with Georgia Power and MEAG together, theirs will increase as well. One of the points I'd like to make and share with you is that as we grow in that area, and you're right, I can't see just yet how our portfolio is going to look like in 2030 or 2040, but it's extremely important, and I have to say this from the operations perspective, that grid reliability, no matter what, depends on a balanced and diverse mix of resources. So as we continue to discuss various proposals, the EMCs and the family of companies, as well as the rest, MEAG and Georgia Power, are very mindful of that balance that we have to make. Clean energy is extremely important to us. Reliability is important as well. So we evaluate every climate proposal through that lens of affordability, but also reliability and then impact to the communities of Georgia electric co-ops that we serve. So just a little bit of addition to that. Thank you.
And if I might just speak for MEAG Power just briefly, our energy supply is primarily nuclear. We were a big holder of nuclear power. About 61% of our supply last year was nuclear, and about 24% was natural gas. Together with our hydropower, we were 69% non-emitting. When we look at our future resource supply, we do expect to be adding renewables, just as the other utilities mentioned, balancing that with some type of storage, and then reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, particularly depending on how the legislative and regulatory scheme moves in Washington. But we have a very strong base supply right now, but we do expect to need to be transitioning over time into more renewables and probably some reduction in fossil fuels, as long as we can keep the renewables reliable.
Thank you. Who's next? Representative Singleton, you had a question.
Yes, sir. Thank you. My question is going to be for Mr. Ford. It kind of applies to everybody, but actually piggybacking off of my colleague here, Rep. Thomas's question earlier. We've talked about the long-term impact of EVs, but specifically for the EMCs, because the regulatory relationship with you guys. I'm tracking some of the fee credits and the way you're incentivizing EV owners in particular to charge at night and certain hours, and I think I understand the way all that is working. Are we seeing any daily demand peak times. For example, I know that, the amount of power you generate actually varies based on the time of day as well. So if you could just briefly talk about, I know it's very micro, we've been talking really macro, but just on the micro level, if you see any changes or impact to that, and your ability to produce that right power at the right time, at the right moment in the day, and then also just very briefly, if there's anything that you foresee that we should start working on in the legislature to help, solve any potential future problems you see that may cause, that we can get ahead of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. And, the strategies that our EMCs have, I don't really have purview for that as far as any rates or time of day or anything that they would use for the charging of those resources. As far as the load coming in because of the charging and the different times that we see it, we will see it in aggregate as it bundles up to the transmission level. There needs to be good planning, coordination, so that we want to, certainly as a transmission level system, incentivize the charging during the off time period so that you start levelizing that load across the day. Don't add to the peak or add to a problematic time that we're already having trouble with. So we're, at least in our side, we're working with our EMCs to ensure that they have that knowledge and understanding, and then they will in turn put forward their plans to meet that and adjust accordingly. So again, back to my one slide, it's all about the coordination and all about the communication, and we have that plan in place to go forward. Any additional?
Yeah.
Did that answer your? Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. I just want to make sure I understood you right. In terms of Vogtle 3 and 4 coming online, does that add an additional 10% capacity generation for that carbon-free area? Did I read? I think you said 40% would be after Vogtle came online. Did I hear that correctly, or?
Well, so from an energy standpoint, it'll take up a bigger share because it runs so much more. But yeah, I think for Georgia Power, when we look out to once Vogtle's on, we're around 44 right now. We're a little less than that. So yeah, it brings on. I actually have the number. Take a second to look at. Mix my slides all up.
And I guess the reason for that question is obviously that'll be in addition to your current capacity mix. Do you anticipate any of that mix changing once Vogtle 3 and 4 come online and retiring any aging units of any kind?
We could. I think from our standpoint, Vogtle has been in our long-term planning models for years now. And so when we look at the evaluation of do you keep a coal unit or do you not, or do you add solar or not, it's underlying that. So it does bring that good base load generation. So other units that until then that are running more base load will back off because it'll be the cheapest ones on the system. So is that a marginally dispatched coal unit? Is it a combined cycle gas unit that runs a little less? So yes, you would expect it to take some of that production from someone else, but it also frees them up, right? So that base load is great. So now in the peak times that Greg's spoken to from an operations standpoint, you got some other resources now that can do that because Vogtle's coming in as that market.
That's where I was headed to, so
Yeah,
thank you. I appreciate it.
We capture that in our evaluations, and so renewables that we project forward, all of that gets put into some of our evaluations. Greg, anything to add operationally?
No, that was good.
Well, as a farmer, power grid is important to us with tobacco barns burning in the summer, and depending on who you ask, whether it's the EMCs or Georgia Power, as to which one is more reliable, I think it's still up for debate. But we do appreciate y'all keeping the power on. Thank you for what you do.
Well, we partner and we compete, so it's a fun relationship.
It is.
So.
Thank you. I think it's all. Any questions on the folks on Zoom there? Well, like I said, I think these were great presentations, and they addressed what I had in mind. I just know that people, I've had questions, but I think people in general, because of what happened out west there, especially in Texas, and what's been on media and everything, people have it in their mind, are concerned about these types of things, and I think that y'all have addressed these very well. I want to remind everybody in the committee that you have the same information that's on the slides. You have it in your packets. Is that right? And that's some good information to have as reference. I have a question. It's just one question. I guess it's general, but on your second slide here, some of these things related to the crisis out there in Texas. It has a list: frozen instrumentation, frozen coal piles, frozen turbines, or turbines, frozen pipelines. I was wondering about the, I've seen pictures there in different places. Obviously when you have solar panels covered up with snow or ice or whatever, there's going to be an issue. But been curious about the gas pipelines. Now, is that an issue because of frozen instrumentation, or what exactly causes a problem with pipelines in that kind of weather?
So I'm not an expert on pipelines themselves, and so as a companies, as the utilities, we contract with the pipeline companies. So I don't know exactly what caused the issues. I think we'll learn a lot of that out of ERCOT. What we were mentioning was that we do subscribe to pipes on there, but it could be that. I think it could, and Greg may help me here. He deals with it more daily than I do. It could be if you have issues at a compressor station where they put the pressure on the pipes. Is it that issue? And so I think it's going to be some instrumentation. I don't know that the gas is going to be the instrumentation and the compressor stations and the supporting network of the pipelines is what I think it would be, Greg, if there's anything else along that line.
Yeah, I think as far as gas pipelines with winter and the freezing part of it, it's exactly where Jeff was going. Each of these pipeline delivery systems have points of intersection. There's valves, there's directional control points on the actual delivery system. Those type of things are mechanical devices. If they're not insulated and handled appropriately and winterized, can fail just due to the temperature that we have going in place. And then, and to Jeff's point, not really knowing the full impacts of Texas on the supply side of it, I don't know that we can answer that yet until we start hearing more information coming out.
Okay. Well, with that, I think we're right up against the time we have to get out of the room anyway. But I want to thank you all very much. In fact, I want to give you an opportunity, if you would like, Jeff, Greg, and Stephen, if you have anything you'd like to close out with, closing comments or anything, you're more than welcome to.
I would just say thank you for the opportunity to be here. This is something that we think about every day that doesn't get a lot of attention. I actually said that my wife doesn't really know what I do until this happened to her brother in Texas, and now she really knows what I do. So I think it's great for us to talk about it. I think we've got a lot of success in the state. We work, we appreciate the support that the legislator and the PSC provide us, that partnership, that good constructive relationship that we have to help move the state forward, and we've got a good process in place. So we appreciate the opportunity to come out and talk about how we do these types of things.
Well, appreciate
so we thank the opportunity.
Yeah, and I'll just add, thank you for the opportunity, and from the EMC perspective, the family of companies perspective, safety and reliability are always our first concerns, and we work very well in our partnerships with Georgia Power, MEAG, as we provide that reliability across the state, and we think that's a very strong perspective for all of us to be in here in Georgia.
Thank you.
Steve?
Yes, thank you. Just one closing comment. As I mentioned earlier, we do take an obligation to serve our customers. All of us do, very seriously. And in planning and ensuring the systems are reliable is a key part of that. As was said earlier, we work very cooperative. We compete in some areas, but we all work very cooperatively to make sure the generation and transmission system are as reliable as we can make them. So I think the cooperative relationship, as was mentioned earlier, is a key in the success we have here in Georgia. Thank you for the opportunity to cover that today.
Well, Thank you all. I think you provided it, in my mind anyway, exactly what I thought we were looking for. It's a lot of help. I wanted to remind the members of the committee that, especially the newer people, I think everybody else knows this, but all these entities are great about providing information. If there's a question that has arisen or arises to you after this that you need information on, they're always great to come back and provide information, provide help. So with that, thank you all for being here and providing these presentations. Thank you, members of the committee. And with that, we are adjourned.